Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the big issues of the day we need to be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and no one's going to be cancelled for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is Dr Alam Mendoza, director of the foreign affairs think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. And here's what we're debating on the show. Saber-rattling rhetoric from Moscow, but should Putin's threats be taken seriously? As Russia has the audacity to bomb Kiev while the UN Secretary General was there, how scared should we be of escalation? As one of British so-called ISIS beetles faces sentencing in America, is the West now dangerously ignoring the threat of Islamist terrorism? And I round off the week with my usual litany of indignant disgruntlement. Friday's Alex Agenda coming your way at the end of the show. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. But what do you need to talk about? Email gbnews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. But first, it's time for the GB News headlines.
Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 2. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The UK is sending experts to Ukraine to help investigate any potential Russian war crimes. The Foreign Secretary's announcement follows the death of a British military veteran in Ukraine this week. Liz Truss says a team of investigators will arrive in neighbouring Poland early next month with the aim to help prosecute Moscow. Following talks at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Ms Truss said it's vital those who commit war crimes are held to account.
We want to see justice done for the people of Ukraine. We've seen appalling war crimes committed, the use of rape and sexual violence. We will be sending in a British evidence collecting team, working with the Ukrainian authorities, working with the ICC. We've been talking today about the urgency of making sure justice is done, and that also we call out rape as a use of weapon in war.
2 British charity workers have reportedly been captured by the Russian military in Ukraine. It's understood the volunteers were detained earlier this week at a checkpoint close to Zaporizhia in the south. The 2 men, both civilians, were working as part of a joint humanitarian project helping evacuation efforts. The reports haven't yet been independently verified. Dominic Byrne from the Charity Presidium Network says the organisation hasn't heard from the workers since Monday.
On Wednesday afternoon, or Wednesday evening, sorry, I got a call and messages from contacts of theirs back in England saying that they are missing, and we believe we know where they are and that they've been taken by Russians. We have had contact with the lady that they were evacuating south of Zaporozhye, and we've had a statement from her to say actually 3 hours after they're supposed to get there on Monday that the Russian soldiers were interrogating her and her family about these 2 British guys that they picked up.
A special operation will take place today to try and evacuate civilians from the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. The decision was announced by the Ukrainian president's office. Hundreds of civilians are said to be sheltering in bunkers underneath the plant, which has been sealed off by Russian forces. It's thought around 500 wounded Ukrainian fighters are in there, some in a serious condition. Residents still in the heavily damaged city have described the Russian attacks.
It was a massacre, a scary thing, when the shells were flying over. Shells, rounds and all such. You can't brave it out, but we endured it. A shell exploded 8 meters away from the toilet. I didn't make it in time to get to the basement. I felt the heat on my face. But whatever, thank God it will all be okay.
It's terrible. It's like when they show the last days of the planet. The same thing was here. We were hungry. The child was crying when the shells were hitting near the house. We were thinking, this is it. This is the end. It can't be described. Only ones who are here have experienced it. I can't put it in words. It is very horrible.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of trying to humiliate the United Nations. It's after 2 missiles were fired into Kiev during a visit by the Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. The rockets shook the central district in Ukraine's capital. One of them struck a residential building, killing a journalist and injuring at least 10 people. Back here, MPs will now be offered individual security advice tailored to specific threats they face. It's after a review was launched following the murder of Sir David Amess last year. He was the second MP to be killed in less than 6 years. Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered in 2016. Threats will be handled by a new multi-agency team, including the police, the Home Office and other government security experts. The Labour Party has now confirmed that its deputy leader was with Sir Keir Starmer at a gathering in Durham during lockdown. Previously, journalists had been told Angela Rayner wasn't at the event in which Sir Keir was filmed drinking beer. Now a source insists that was a mistake made in good faith. Tory MPs have asked police to reconsider their decision not to investigate the event. The government's stepping up efforts to tackle supply shortages affecting hormone replacement therapy. Health Secretary Sajid Javid has appointed Madeleine McTernan to lead a new HRT task force. The Department for Health and Social Care says she'll use her knowledge from the coronavirus vaccine rollout to help address the shortages. 3-time Wimbledon champion Boris Becker's at Southwark Crown Court for sentencing after being found guilty of flouting the terms of his 2017 bankruptcy. The former world #1 tennis player was accused of transferring hundreds of thousands of pounds from his business account and failing to declare a property in his hometown of Lyman in Germany. Becker was also convicted of hiding an €825,000 bank loan. This is GB News. We'll have more for you as it happens now, though. It's back to We Need to Talk About with Alex.
He said he wouldn't invade. He did. His troops have committed mass war crimes. He blames Ukraine. And his invasion has followed the pattern of setting up false flag attacks as justification for Russian aggression. So why should we believe a single word Vladimir Putin says, especially when his only deterrence to NATO supporting Ukraine is the nuclear one? Would he really resort to pressing the big red button? Well, Russian state media is awash with threats that the Kremlin kleptocrat would not hesitate to launch weapons of mass destruction against the West if we continue to arm Kiev. Harrowing rhetoric echoed in a Russian state media report in which the presenters said that in the event of nuclear apocalypse, they would be the ones going to heaven. While we are not rushing to build nuclear bunkers nor testing air raid sirens, Putin's threats haven't fallen on deaf ears. Zelensky's desperation for more military support has long been met with a degree of reticence, with the prospect of escalation into all-out global war, a gamble no sane world leader is willing to take. And so, what next? Is Ben Wallace right in his assertion that Putin could use Russia's May the 9th Victory Day to launch a blistering attack somewhere? Is the fabled rat so cornered that a sudden vicious retaliation could shock the world? Or, in the 21st century information wars, are the chilling threats emanating from Moscow simply tactical propaganda to stave off further NATO involvement? Well, I'm joined now by Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow on Russia and Eurasia at the Policy Institute's Chatham House. Keir, people are talking about an escalation, and Putin again is putting out, particularly in Russian state media, threats of escalation to a nuclear level. But how much of this is propaganda and power projection, or how seriously should we take these threats?
Well, there are two very different things to bear in mind. One is Russia's actual nuclear doctrine for when they would use nuclear weapons. And that, of course, is very different from when a Western power would do it. And it's much more an operational decision based on military terms than a strategic political one, as it would be in the West. But then there's the completely different question of, as you put it, the tactical propaganda, the rhetoric that we hear from President Putin, from Russian state television, making these nuclear threats. And the reason why they are so effective is that everybody forgets that they're an absolutely standard part of Russian rhetoric that we've been hearing for years, in fact, decades. Russia doesn't need to be at war to be saying this kind of stuff. And they build on a long and very consistent program of Russia trying to whip up fears of escalation in the West that's been going on for far longer than the war itself. The network of propagandists and agents of influence and useful idiots that Russia uses to push its messages has been warning of escalation with exactly that same intent as they have now, to try to constrain the West, to try to give the impression that if you get in Russia's way, if you impede Russia trying to do what it wants anywhere in the world, then you're going to risk a conflict. And that conflict will inevitably escalate to nuclear war. Now, that message has got across so effectively that we hear decision makers in the West, including military service chiefs, echoing those exact same phrases all the time now. But that's because Russia has put so much hard work into making sure that that's the background against which people are hearing these threats now.
Liz Truss, our Foreign Secretary, has said that this war could drag on for a decade. Is it time, perhaps, that NATO were to turn a deaf ear, say, to the Kremlin's rhetoric and actually amplify their retaliation and do more, essentially, whether it be indirectly via tooling up Ukraine or perhaps even taking further steps and committing perhaps to some form of aggression?
Well, there's a very big difference between supporting Ukraine in helping it win this war on its own and actually getting involved. And that is the line that has been drawn relatively sensibly by Western politicians. Of course, the time in which to make that decision was before the invasion. And that's the time when the US, the UK, Canada actually pulled their troops out of Western Ukraine, where they're on training missions, in order that they didn't get in the way of the Russian invasion. And there can't have been a clearer green light to President Putin than that. And all of it was about how do we not get involved in this conflict, which was effectively leaving Ukraine on its own. Now that Liz Truss and other Western politicians have realized the implications of that, and the realization has sunk in that Ukraine is not the issue here, Ukraine is just the focal point of this broader war by Russia against the West, what we're hearing now from herself, from the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, about how this war needs to end is really based on a recognition of what it really means and the long-term prospects, not just for Ukraine winning or losing, but actually for the future security of the whole of Europe.
I mean, the difficulty is, of course, the longer this conflict drags on, the more that sanctions are going to bite not only Russia, but have an impact back in Europe as well. We're already in an energy crisis, which is continuing to escalate. How do you see this playing out? Is it going to be that it will splutter to a demise when Putin runs out of money? Or is he going to do something along the lines of what Ben Wallace has said and potentially strike and strike big so it looks like he's garnered some kind of scalp?
Yes, when we're talking about a war of attrition, it's not just military attrition, it's also the economies of both sides. And let's not forget that Ukraine needs economic support as well, because its infrastructure is being consistently hammered by Russian airstrikes and missiles. Its exports have been interdicted by a Russian sea blockade. And all of this will mean that Ukraine needs help in actually continuing to function as a state. And Russia can drive itself into the ground, as it's done so many times before, in pursuit of an unwinnable war for far longer than its adversaries can. And that, in effect, is how Russia wins its wars in the long term, by grinding them down. But Europe is also feeling the results now of the decisions about the balance of costs that it's taken over decades, deciding that it didn't need to invest in defending itself and taking on the risk of the much higher costs of a broader war later on. So it's now a case of playing catch up and realizing that those costs are now coming home to roost, that Europe is now paying the price of its dependence, for example, on Russian energy, and its failure to take an interest in the real implications of Russian behavior and what that meant for Europe preparing to defend itself.
Keir, fantastic having you back on the programme. That's Keir Giles from Chatham House. Well, we can speak now to former Royal Marines Commando and filmmaker Emile Gessen, who is in Ukraine covering the conflict. Great to have you back on the show as well, Emile.
Hello.
We saw yesterday, didn't we, after a period of relative calm, Kiev being struck once again by Russia as the US Secretary General was there. What is the mood on the ground now in the capital? Life was almost getting back to some semblance of normality.
Yeah, the war it's only been a couple of weeks since Ukraine was under attack heavily from the north through areas like Irpin and Bucha as the Russians pushed away. So really, the mood within Kiev is that people going back to normal, like you're saying, to a certain degree, but everyone knows the war's still ongoing. The missile strikes yesterday were an eye-opener for many people. So many people have returned to the city to get on with life as much as they can. But it was an eye-opener to say, right, Russia can still strike, even though they're not on the gates of Kiev at the moment.
Now, there's been news out about 2 Brits feared captured by Russian forces. The understanding is that they were probably there to try and provide independent humanitarian assistance, not part of any organisation. What is your awareness of other foreign nationals doing that sort of thing and the risk potentially that it poses to themselves, but also the risk that that could pose to the wider theatre of war if Russian troops are under the impression that we actually have foreign fighters on the ground?
Yeah, Russia is fully aware. There was a British former soldier who was a volunteer fighter that was killed yesterday, a guy called Scott. There's also, like you mentioned, the 2 humanitarian aids men that have been captured down in the southeast that have been held by the Russians. I know a group of journalists that a month ago ran into a group of Russians, Chechens on a checkpoint, and they checked their ID cards, their passports, and sent them back on their way. So the fact is that the Russians have taken 2 humanitarian people here is an eye-opener. It's alerting especially for the UK government to say, right, we've got 2 men that were being captured that were actually in prison by the Russians. Now we've got 2 men, humanitarian aids workers, are now being taken. So politically for the UK, it's not good being in the limelight like this. But Russia's fully aware that there are several hundred volunteer fighters from the UK that are currently here in Ukraine fighting.
Emile, thank you ever so much. Emile Gessen joining us live from Ukraine. Well, let's get the views of my studio guest, Dr Alam Mendoza, director of the Foreign Affairs think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, I mean, people are talking up, aren't they, the idea that this is going to escalate, that the 9th of May date as Russia's Victory Day has been flagged for a few weeks now as a day by which Putin might want to have achieved something. Do you think that this now is going to enter a new and more perilous phase?
Well, I think, yes. I think you're right to highlight the 9th of May. It's always sort of a big date in the Russian calendar. It was on the Soviet calendar beforehand. And, of course, it does celebrate the great victory of the Great Patriotic War. So what better time to unveil a contemporary victory than a day which already sees a massive military parade, Russia's military prowess, the pride of the country, all out there. So yes, I do think we're in a difficult time, either because he's going to press for a big win, or if he starts to lose further, then there may be a reaction from him to try and make sure he does win.
Now, the UK is sending 8,000 troops, we understand, to Eastern Europe, to Poland. What does that indicate? What is this sort of mobilisation of boots, albeit on the ground in a NATO country, represent?
Well, it merely suggests again that we are committed to the defence of the NATO alliance, that we are willing to put troops on the front lines of the NATO alliance as a deterrent factor to say, whatever you think of escalating, however you might do that, and maybe it's just bluster, but maybe it isn't, here is a red line that if one Russian puts a foot into Poland or another NATO country, we will respond, and we have the force in place now to respond.
Now, there are fears already that this conflict could spill over the border into Moldova. There have been indications of attacks in Transnistria. Russia is blaming Ukrainians for that, separatist rebels. It is, of course, a Russian-controlled tranche of the country. But if that does happen, if Russia is seeking to build some sort of land bridge between Moldova and the Black Sea coastline of Ukraine, what could that represent? Would that mean that NATO have to react further? I mean, Moldova is a neutral country, but it is edging the conflict further wider towards more Ukraine borders.
Well, in fact, it does. It brings, if he goes into Moldova proper, it'll bring him right to the borders of the EU, in now the southern flank as well as the northern flank with the Baltic states. So suddenly you've got the potential for him to decide, well, I won't stop at Moldova, maybe Romania's next, the country next door, or Slovakia, something like that. So there's a very real fear that were he to escalate the conflict, and Moldova, as you state, is not a NATO country, it's not an EU country, we have no obligation to defend it. It's unlikely, of course, we're going to suddenly rush in and defend it, but it would suggest that he has, again, broader ambitions than he has currently made out.
I mean, my first guest, Keir Giles from Chatham House, saying that Russia's notorious for being able to fight until the bitter end, to almost outlast its opponents and survive beyond expectations. Is our approach of simply trying to turn off money and tool up Ukraine going to be enough in the long run? Or, like Liz Truss says, is there a fear this could drag on for a decade?
Well, it could do. I mean, unfortunately, if you look at the previous civil, sort of conflict in Europe when you had Serb attacks on, the former Yugoslav states, you end up with the reality of something that can last for a while. Because if it is very difficult for one side to win, but the other side's not strong enough to defeat it, then you do end up with stalemate. It goes on and on and on. And the great fear here is, or the two great fears, the first fear is that he will win straight away. The second fear is that this will just last and destroy Ukraine completely. Yes, it'll have a big impact on him. Maybe he'll be able to outlast Ukraine, but it's a bit like watching one of those old-style boxing matches over 15 rounds where both guys come out at the end, hardly able to stand. I'm not sure either really wins at the end of the day.
Alan, thank you very much. I want to know your views on all of my stories today. You can, of course, email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet the programme @gbnews, so I get an impression of what you, the nation, really thinks about the subjects we're talking about. You're with GB News on TV and radio. It's time for a short break now and a check on the weather forecast.
Hi there, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Another fine day for most of us. Sunny for many, especially the west, but it will stay cloudy in some areas, especially the east. We have at the moment high pressure centred over the UK, but around that high winds are coming in generally from the east still, so it's much cooler in the east, and there is still some stubborn cloud coming in from the North Sea, so that will tend to stick around, I think, for eastern and central parts of England through much of the day. Cloud building also for central parts of Scotland, perhaps the odd shower for the Highlands and the Grampians. Otherwise, for the vast majority, it's a dry day, and the best of the sunshine will be across northern England, Northern Ireland, Western Scotland, Wales and the southwest, where we get the sunshine, 15, 16, perhaps even 17 Celsius, but where we keep that easterly breeze, Norwich, only 11 degrees. Into the evening, and cloud will float further south, and it will break up for a time, so lengthy clear spells, especially for much of England and Wales, and it's under those clear skies across the southern half of the UK, where the lowest temperatures will be a touch of frost. In sheltered spots, a chilly start to the day, 2 Celsius there in Birmingham, 3 in London, but a milder start for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, 6 or 7 degrees here, because the cloud is arriving. And that cloud brings some rainfall, mainly during Saturday morning, northern and western Scotland, Northern Ireland as well, a damp start to the day, some heavier bursts coming along by the afternoon for the west coast of Scotland and for the higher ground. But for much of England and Wales, well, it stays dry. There'll be some decent spells of sunshine and it's warmer, especially in the east where temperatures could rise to 17 or 18 degrees. Now, the rain in the north tends to stumble further south into Saturday evening, reaching North Wales, parts of northern England. It breaks up. It's largely light and patchy, so not particularly helpful for gardeners, I suspect. And then showers to start next week, turning drier later.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Another royal tour to the Caribbean mired in the sort of negative press the Buckingham Palace outreach effort is designed to subdue. This time, Prince Edward and the Countess of Wessex have been in the West Indies, where protesters have demanded that the Queen apologise for slavery. The relationship between the Windsors and the Windies may appear strained, but it's actually one of the few places where the royal family and former British colonies in the Caribbean is underscored by the fact that the Queen remains constitutional head of state, something most other Commonwealth countries shook off during a succession of independence declarations across Africa and Asia. Islands divided by a romantic belief or perhaps pragmatic support for a system many others regard as anachronistic, even insulting. How will it unfold? And can the royals really help to hold in place heritage that seems so out of step in the modern world? Our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, has been looking back on their time in the region.
If ever there was an omen warning of the hostile welcome, perhaps that was it. The Earl and Countess of Wessex toured the Caribbean this week to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee and try to shore up support for the monarchy. But before the tour started, the Grenada leg was postponed. No reason was given. Following Barbados' decision to remove the Queen as head of state in favour of a republic, there's been growing calls for Britain to pay damages for its role in the slave trade. Ernesto Cook, a journalist at the St Vincent Times, suggests the royals should take more of an interest.
Engage the common man and find out more about what's making them want to pull away from the republic. That would be a good thing for them, I can tell you that.
Edward and Sophie got stuck in, embracing Caribbean culture, food and music.
Take me home to paradise, I wanna go home.
The couple also highlighted important charity work. Sophie's a global ambassador for a blind prevention organisation and met local representatives in St Vincent. But huge welcoming crowds were accompanied by protests. One sign called on the Queen to apologise for slavery. But the numbers attending were tiny compared to the country's population. Prince Edward was perhaps put in an uncomfortable position when the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda urged him to use his diplomatic influence over reparations. One theme remained strong, though, the love and respect for Her Majesty the Queen, this year marking 70 years on the throne. It's unlikely another Caribbean country will become a republic anytime soon. But Kadeem Joseph, an Antiguan journalist, thinks Queen Elizabeth herself is the reason there's still support for the monarchy.
A lot of us see her as that figurehead. And when she passes on, and I hope that's no time soon, but if that were to happen, I think it would be easier for countries like mine to let go of the monarchy.
There's no doubt there's lots of fans of the monarchy in the Caribbean. Palace officials will be watching the reaction closely and perhaps reimagining how to approach tours to developing Commonwealth nations in the future. Cameron Walker, GB News.
Well, joining me now to discuss the mixed reception to the royal visit is Conservative commentator Calvin Robinson, plus writer and community advocate Dr Velma McClymont. Velma, fantastic to have you back on the show. Where do you stand on these protests that have happened at basically every royal visit to the region, where people are saying, well, look, you know, we know our heritage, we know our connection to your country, and it's about time reparations were paid and an apology given?
Yes, because as I said on the programme before, these protests, we've just heard that some are quite small, but these can grow. And it's important for people to realise that times have changed, the winds of change are blowing, and people want the subject of reparations to be dealt with. And that's very important for any royal tour. You can't close your eyes to what is happening in the world right now and what the Caribbean and also the diaspora are asking for.
Calvin, what about you? I mean, it must be extremely uncomfortable history for a lot of people in the Caribbean when it comes to a question of should the royal family apologise for historic wrongs. Would that be appropriate?
No, nobody. Practically nobody's asking for this. St. Lucia has a population of 190,000. There were 10 people at this protest. That's 0.005% of the population. It's not enough to say it's a minority. It's a super minority. What we've actually seen here is that we've seen the royals, we've seen Prince Edward and Sophie go to St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, and they've had a great time. We've seen some footage on GB News earlier. There's some video footage, but there's plenty of great photographs out there of them exploring the countries, talking to regular people, having a fantastic time and celebrating the Jubilee of Her Majesty the Queen, 70 years on the throne. This is all great news. There is a tiny, tiny minority of people who are unhappy with this. These are Republicans, and that's fine. There should be room for that in a democracy. But if any country wants to explore the idea of becoming a republic, it must be a democratic process, unlike what we saw in Barbados, which was terrible.
Velma, Calvin, they're saying it's actually only a tiny minority of people who would like to seek the sort of constitutional change that perhaps these protesters would call for, where the Queen would no longer be, or whoever the monarch is, would no longer be the head of state. Is that how you read the room? Do you think it's only a tiny minority, or do you think that this is a movement gathering momentum?
I think this is a movement. We must understand this is the international decade for people of African descent. It ends in 2024. We are calling for reparations. Calvin may well say it's a small minority or whatever, and people and Sophie and Edward are having a fantastic time. We cannot silence the voices crying out for reparations. You might not see them. Calvin, whatever happens in the Caribbean impacts on the community here. Unless you are a part of the community, unless you are sending reparations home to the smaller islands and Jamaica, you do not know what is really going on. People are asking for an apology from the royal family for their part in the atrocities committed under slavery, the dehumanization and racial subjugation of a people. You cannot silence it by PR, photo opportunities. They're all well and good.
Calvin, I just want to cut in here because we've got very little time left on this. Calvin, do you have a very quick response to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it? You can say people want this, but it's all anecdotal. Dr. Velma has no evidence. The evidence we've suggested seems that not many people do want this. There are some people stuck in a victimhood mentality, and that's a shame, and we need to help them out of that. But in regards to reparations, who pays whom? It doesn't make any financial sense for deprived black people in this country to be paying well-off people, black people in another country. The maths doesn't add up. None of it makes any sense. It's time to move forward and get beyond all of this identity politics and nonsense. People love Her Majesty the Queen. People love the royal family. People love being a part of the British Commonwealth of Nations.
Both, thank you ever so much. I appreciate your time here. Always love a lively debate on GB News. That's Calvin Robinson and Dr. Velma McClymont. We could have kept that going for a long time, I'm sure. But it is, in fact, now coming up time for the news. You are with GB News on TV and DAB Radio. We're going to be talking about one of the British ISIS Beetle terrorists due to be sentenced in the US today. Do we need to do more to tackle Islamist terrorism in the UK? First, though, it's time for a check on the news headlines.
It's 2:33. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. 2 British charity workers reportedly captured by the Russian military in Ukraine have been named as Paul Urey and Dylan Healy. It's understood the volunteers were detained earlier this week at a checkpoint close to Zaporizhia in the south. The 2 men, both civilians, were working as part of a joint humanitarian project helping evacuation efforts. The UK is sending experts to Ukraine to help investigate any potential Russian war crimes. The Foreign Secretary's announcement follows the death of a British military veteran in Ukraine this week. Liz Truss says a team of investigators will arrive in neighbouring Poland early next month with the aim to help prosecute Moscow.
We will be sending them out in the month of May. They'll be working closely with the Ukrainian authorities. This is about collecting a wide range of evidence, witness statements, forensic evidence, video evidence. We're also using British intelligence to help show the links between what is happening on the front line and the Russian authorities.
The Labour Party has now confirmed that its deputy leader was with Sir Keir Starmer at a gathering in Durham during lockdown. Previously, journalists had been told Angela Rayner wasn't at the event at which Sir Keir was filmed drinking beer. Now a source insists that was a mistake made in good faith. Tory MPs have asked police to reconsider their decision not to investigate the event. A trial date of November the 14th has been set for a man accused of the murder of a missing mother of 2. Andrew Burfield has appeared via video link at Preston Crown Court to confirm his name during a 7-minute hearing earlier today. He's charged with the murder of Katie Kenyon, who vanished 7 days ago after being seen getting into a van in Burnley in Lancashire. Patients with arthritis will now be advised to lose weight and exercise to improve their quality of life. Government guidance issued to the NHS says overweight patients should be told their pain can be reduced if they shed the pounds. More than 10 million people in the UK have arthritis or similar conditions. TV Online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. It's back to We Need to Talk About with Alex in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
British terrorist Alexander Coty, one of the infamous so-called ISIS Beatles, will be sentenced in America today. The monster was extradited to face charges of the medieval torture and brutal murder of Western hostages in Syria. Videos of the crude beheadings carried out by the Islamic State's terrorist cell shocked the world. But is the world today really a safer place? Or is it simply that other events have caused the West to take its eye off the ball? News this week that Islamist radicalisation has infested UK prisons, the brutal stabbing of MP Sir David Amess and a spate of terror attacks across France in recent years suggests that, far from being subdued, hostilities and perils that once haunted headlines are still bubbling violently under the surface. A Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, something once regarded as so dangerous to stability that the US and the UK spent over $1 trillion on a 20-year conflict to try to prevent it, has preceded border skirmishes with Pakistan, a country that's recently ousted its leader. So what next? And what threat to the UK? Well, let's talk first to our studio guest, Dr Alam Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, I understand that Prevent, the organisation set up to try and prevent terrorism, is due to come under an overhaul. Do you think that we are doing enough to prevent terrorism? Is it a topic that, because it's dropped out of news headline, risks surprising us all again?
Well, I'm afraid it exists. We saw, of course, just with the Sir David Amess murder case, that it exists, it's on our streets, it's happening. And there are numerous plots being foiled on a weekly basis. That much is evident. I think, though, what has certainly slipped off, people are looking at the international scene, forgetting there are domestic challenges, and there certainly is a dramatic reluctance to look at the issue of Islamist terrorism as opposed to, say, far-right terrorism, which has, of course, been on the increase. That bit is very easy to talk about. Everyone's quite happy talking about that. But the stuff with the ISIS Beatles and such like, and contemporary equivalents, that appears to many politicians a much more difficult proposition to tackle.
Do you think it's the fact that because we have actually had the Sir David Amess stabbing, but we haven't had a big mass terrorist event now for over a decade, that we might be getting a bit complacent? And yet we've had a report out this week about how much radicalisation is going on in our prisons, something that Dominic Raab has pledged that he is going to tackle. Do you think that there is a risk that unless something big happens, people do get complacent, from local authorities to police forces to everyday citizens who should perhaps be keeping a closer eye when they see suspicious goings-on?
Well, very much so. I think, no one wants terrorist attacks. Remember the last few that actually occurred. The big ones were in 2017, the Manchester bombing, the London Bridge attacks. But, that seems a lifetime away. We've had COVID since then, people were locked. And I think the COVID issue also kept things subdued because, of course, people were not on the streets. People were kept at home. And you didn't see this happening quite the same way. Of course, the danger is that having taken our eye off the ball and gone, well, this seems not to be a problem anymore, people who were radicalised during COVID at home by watching social media, by actually getting, bad ideas, are now able to circulate and plan attacks. And there is a fear now, I think, that there is going to be a new spate of attacks driven by those who were radicalised over the last 2-3 years, who may lead into another attempt. The mode will be very different to what we saw beforehand, because you don't have a terrorist organisation like ISIS able right now to do spectaculars, but you will get attacks.
What is the significance of Afghanistan now being controlled by the Taliban? I mean, a huge amount of resources were put into trying to stop that from happening. But could it be argued that, in a sense, this puts a plug in international terrorism? I mean, it's understood that the Taliban and ISIS don't often see eye to eye, and that might actually reduce the idea of reprisals in foreign countries because we're no longer putting troops on the ground in places like Afghanistan.
Oh, if only that were really true, Alex, in the sense that if only what the jihadists told us was really what was going on. I mean, if you look at the history of, say, jihadist terrorism for the past 2-3 decades, the course has changed. Basically, it's changed because the cause is not about Western intervention in foreign countries. It's not about Western troops on the ground here, there and everywhere. What it's actually about is about an ideology within a religion, a section of a religion, which has very aggressive and very outdated views, which wishes to impose that upon everyone else. And so the mistake is always to think this is about us. It's not about us. It's about them. It's about what they actually want. Now, they tailor it to go, oh, it's Syria this year, Afghanistan next year. Back in the 90s, it was Bosnia, it was Kosovo. But there will be a new excuse next year, the year after, and so on, until, they get their way. So the problem is it's an ideological issue, not a foreign policy issue.
And what is the significance of Imran Khan being ousted from power in Pakistan? Is that potentially signalling a Pakistan once again riddled with instability, where you've got the big powers of the military and the intelligence services who essentially behind the scenes run that country and have been known historically to be very sympathetic towards the Taliban, in some instances harbouring them. I mean, of course, Osama bin Laden was finally found on his compound in Taliban, and it was believed that a lot of people in the intelligence agencies in Pakistan knew full well where he was.
Look, the Pakistanis have played a double-handed game for the last 2 decades on this, and longer, in fact. Imran Khan, if you look at his statements, was very anti-Western and very pro-Taliban. That didn't stop him being removed because he'd gone against the power of the army, essentially, the intelligence services in particular, within Pakistan. They will play their own game. The reality is we should be aware that they are not trustworthy allies, that they are playing their own game constantly, and their game frequently differs from ours in terms of the goals of trying to crack down on this radical form of religion as opposed to fostering it, which is in their interests. In
terms of domestic terrorism, bringing it back home, where poses or who poses the biggest threat to us right now? When we look at things through the prism of Islamist terrorism, is it in a network of mosques? Is it radicalised hate preachers? Is it in the prison system? Is it all of it?
Well, it's all of it in the sense, because if you look at the watch list, which is the sort of 43,000 people MI5 have on their kind of list, doesn't mean they're watched the whole time, but they're the people they think are most likely to cause a terrorist attack. Those people are a mix of the things that you've identified. Some were radicalised in prison, some were radicalised in religious institutions, some were radicalised online. Others, of course, are people they didn't even know about, not on the list, people who will suddenly appear and cause a problem. However, it is worth remembering, most of the people who've been responsible for at least jihadist attacks over the past decade were known to the authorities in some way, shape or form and weren't followed up properly, which, to link it back to what you were saying at the start, is why the Prevent Review is so desperately needed. Right now, there are offenders or potential offenders who are being scrutinised, being allowed to go free, and who then commit terrorist attacks maybe years down the line, but they were known and it wasn't dealt with. So the key is, can we get a counter-extremism policy, counter-terrorism policy in place that really works now?
In terms of reforming Prevent, there have been talks about perhaps taking powers away from local authorities, making it a more professionalised system. Would that be the right approach, or is it actually very important to engage society at all levels in order to make sure that the Prevent system actually has the broadest possible reach?
Well, you need referrals, obviously. You need people who are around there in civil society to say, actually, I've seen X behaving a little suspiciously. I'm worried about it. Why? I don't know what's happened to them in the last few months. Something's gone wrong there. You need that to come up, of course. Professionals aren't going to be able to find that kind of information. But then to act on it, you've got to have national security professionals, dispassionate people who are not going to be, if you like, politically biased one way or the other, thinking about, oh, let's look at a certain group, let's push those people up the chain into the channel programme, let's not put the other group in. The suspicion has been that because of the strange way that the referrals to prevent work, when historically, apart from last year, the majority has always been radical Muslims going into that. But then in Channel, you end up with a majority of far-right people going through rather than radical Muslims. You then end up with a situation, well, how did that happen? And when you end up at the MI5 watch list stage, about 90% of them are radical Muslims. So clearly something's not right in the way the process is working. And somewhere there's been a disconnect. Now, my view is let the national security professionals decide who to put up, who not to put up, because that gets you away from local parochial agendas. In that sense, do you think the system's been somewhat politicised? Yes, very much so. I think we've been fed a diet for the last 5 years on news channels, not on GBNews, of course, which tells the truth, but on many other news channels where we're told repeatedly the far right are the biggest threat to, in the UK. They go fastest growing, sometimes biggest. It's not true. They might be the fastest growing, but they're starting from a very small base. We don't want it to increase, of course, but the absolute numbers remain as a terrorist threat from the jihadist element. And we're not being told that clearly and loudly in the way that other media organisations want us to hear. Alan, thank you. I really want to know your views on everything we've been talking about today. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet the programme @gbnews. Well, you've been sending us your thoughts throughout the show today. And Robert says, yes, we should be concerned about Putin's threats. A wounded and cornered dog is dangerous. Nick says, Putin is looking for more threats and words from the West, which will be twisted and used by Putin to escalate. We should play down his mindless grandstanding and use action, not words. Paul says, I believe World War III is coming. Thanks, Paul. And it's our fault. We've interfered into a civil war, nothing to do with us, and created a potential World War III. Without our interference, it'd be over now with less casualties. Fewer, Paul, fewer. He hasn't attacked Europe. We're attacking him. Well, pretty interesting thoughts there. I'm not sure much of the nation would agree with you on that one. You've also been sending in your views about Prince Edward and the Countess of Wessex's tour following that rather dramatic debate we had earlier on in the show. Michael says, totally agree with them. Reparations in the form of one-way tickets back to their ancestral lands. Not sure about that one. Alan says, what aid investment has the UK provided to these former colonies over the years? If they want to change their head of state, crack on. We really do love hearing your views, so please do keep sending them in throughout our shows. Now, I'm off camping this weekend to a phone signal black spot in deepest, darkest middle of nowhere to escape from the horrors of the 21st century and dig myself a nuclear bunker. Lord knows, I may need it. But before I hunker down in pleasant pastures on clouded hills, I've dredged up the best of the worst from the papers, so you can exercise your pint-raising, fist-shaking hand before this bank holiday weekend. It is, of course, time for the Alex Agenda. In the Mog versus Doris working from home novella, the Prince of Politesse and Doyen of Dignity, the honourable representative for the 19th century, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has gracefully proven his point. Having called for civil servants to get back to offices, with some departments having fewer than a quarter of staff bothering to turn up to work, Mr Mogg's spot checks to Whitehall workplaces, creaking under privileged absenteeism, saw him place these rather polite personal messages on empty desks. His efforts, however, were met with scorn by the Culture Secretary, who said his approach conjured images of burning tallow, roomy eyes and Marley's ghost, a quote from A Christmas Carol. Now, quite what any of that has to do with working from home, I've no idea. As a graduate of literature, I'm alarmed the Culture Secretary doesn't know her Dickens. Perhaps citing Gradgrind's pursuit of profitable enterprise would have been more apt in addressing the Minister for Government's efficiency's great expectations when it comes to the different work ethics in what often feels like a tale of two cities, while the country struggles under hard times. Poor little Doris. And those of you who got all the Dickens references in that, well done, give yourself an A-star. Now, as Putin continues to unleash unbridled fury on Ukraine and the West scrambles to stop him in his tracks, stopping short of provoking nuclear retaliation by using indirect arms provision and gruelling sanctions, the unscrupulous big European energy firms have their own agenda. While the EU managed
eventually, to impose restrictions on Putin power, or be they relatively feeble. The giant corporates are preparing to undercut the bans by agreeing to pay for Russian gas in rubles, one of Putin's demands to help him fund his bloody campaign. Large gas companies in Germany, Austria, Slovakia and Hungary plan to open accounts with Gazprom Bank after Moscow halted gas supplies to Bulgaria and Poland yesterday. You know, I think it's time NATO did deploy boots on the ground in Ukraine, starting with these energy execs. It's not as if Putin could consider them hostile actors. Unceremoniously sacked from her job following Stasi-esque interrogation, smeared, shunned and shamed like a social pariah. The treatment of a girl guiding leader who raised concerns about the movement's new rules of inclusion when it comes to, you guessed it, trans people. Having sensibly and sensitively stated safeguarding concerns over permissions to allow a man who simply says he feels like a woman sharing tents, toilets and changing rooms with little girls, Dr Katie Alcock, a senior lecturer in psychology who might know a thing or two about what does and doesn't cause psychological harm, was treated like an abuser for the best part of 4 years. Well, she took Girl Guides to court and won. Perhaps it was the circulation of a photo of a male-born Rainbows and Brownies leader dressed as a dominatrix with the message, "Now behave yourselves or mistress will have to punish you," or the one of them wielding an assault rifle, that made girl guiding think again. And as the Pestminster saga continues, we now learn that a female minister was pinned up against the wall by a male MP and told she must want him because he is a powerful man. This straight off the back of learning that one disgusting pervert was actually watching porn in Parliament in full view of his colleagues. Should be a wake-up call of just how much society is in the gutter. Ask any woman. She'll tell you that sexual harassment is rife. A top professor of sociology told The Telegraph that porn has succeeded to be normalised to such a degree it is now woven into mainstream culture. The result, of course, is little girls being encouraged to look like sex dolls, mainstream porn sites where almost 90% of content is of abuse, rape culture in schools, and a world where women feel threatened every waking moment of their lives. Until porn is treated as the public health crisis and criminal enterprise it has become, things will only get worse. Well, time for Alam Mendoza to wade into any of those topics.
I think there's plenty to talk about there. I mean, I think on the European energy situation, we've known the hypocrisy all along. We know that the Germans in particular and the Italians rely heavily on Russian gas. The idea, therefore, you were going to be able to embargo effectively Russia was dead from the start, and Putin probably knew it. The trouble is the cost of gas has gone up so much. We are literally funding his efforts now to kill Ukrainians. So it's really you're looking at it back. It's a circle that doesn't work. So something has got to give. Surely those countries have to accept there may be some short-term pain, but if we're serious about wanting to win this conflict for Ukraine and for longer term, we're going to have to be serious about how we fund this.
Alan, thank you ever so much. It's been wonderful having you on the programme again today. Lots we've spoken about, lots we've covered. We'll have you back again very soon. Thank you ever so much. Dr Alam Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society. Wow, that's all from me for now. Of course, you can join me again next week. Same time, same place, 2 o'clock here on GB News for We Need to Talk About. But coming up next, of course, it is The Briefing with the wonderful Arlene Forster. However, we do have time before she comes on air to have a look at the weather forecast for this bank holiday weekend. Fingers crossed it's a good one. I certainly hope so, because otherwise I might be washed up the River Wye in my tent. Let's hope that doesn't happen, and I join you again next week. Bye-bye from me and have a glorious weekend.
Hi there, I'm Aidan McGiven from the Met Office. Another fine day for most of us, sunny for many, especially the west, but it will stay cloudy in some areas, especially the east. We have at the moment high pressure centred over the UK, but around that high winds are coming in generally from the east still, so it's much cooler in the east, and there is still some stubborn cloud coming in from the North Sea, so that will tend to stick around, I think, for eastern and central parts of England through much of the day. Cloud building also for central parts of Scotland, perhaps the odd shower for the Highlands and the Grampians. Otherwise, for the vast majority, it's a dry day, and the best of the sunshine will be across northern England, Northern Ireland, Western Scotland, Wales and the southwest, where we get the sunshine, 15, 16, perhaps even 17 Celsius, but where we keep that easterly breeze, Norwich, only 11 degrees. Into the evening, and cloud will float further south, and it will break up for a time, so lengthy clear spells, especially for much of England and Wales, and it's under those clear skies across the southern half of the UK, where the lowest temperatures will be a touch of frost. In sheltered spots, a chilly start to the day, 2 Celsius there in Birmingham, 3 in London, but a milder start for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, 6 or 7 degrees here because the cloud is arriving. And that cloud brings some rainfall, mainly during Saturday morning, northern and western Scotland, Northern Ireland as well, a damp start to the day, some heavier bursts coming along by the afternoon for the west coast of Scotland and for the higher ground. But for much of England and Wales, when it stays dry, there'll be some decent spells of sunshine, and it's warmer, especially in the east, where temperatures could rise to 17 or 18 degrees. Now, the rain in the north tends to stumble further south into Saturday evening, reaching North Wales, parts of northern England. It breaks up. It's largely light and patchy, so not particularly helpful for gardeners, I suspect. And then showers to start next week, turning drier later.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives